So we want churches to analyze themselves and to begin working on church culture rather than numbers.
Hi, I'm Karl Vaters, and welcome to the Church Lobby, conversations on faith and ministry, and to our multi-episode series based on the content of my new book, Desizing the Church, How Church Growth Became a Science, Then an Obsession, and What's Next. My guest this week is Scot McKnight. He's the co-author with Laura Barringer of A Church Called Tov, Forming a Goodness Culture that Resists Abuses of Power and Promotes Healing. This is a book that I quote a few times in Desizing the Church, so it was great to talk with Scot and go deeper on some of these concepts. In this conversation, we dive into the dangers of American meritocracy, the warning signs of a toxic church culture, and the problems with being or following a narcissistic leader, and a whole bunch more. So remember to stick around when the interview is done. I'll come back with an overview of the content, and I'll let you know who I'll be interviewing in next week's Desizing the Church podcast. Scot, welcome to the Church Lobby today. I really appreciate your being with us.
Well, thank you, Karl, for this invitation. Good to meet you and be with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Even if we're doing it electronically, it is nice to be able to see face to face anyway. I know our listeners are listening to audio only, but we get the visual experience as well. I want to spend some time with you today. We're doing this series of interviews that are based on folks that I quoted in my new book, Desizing the Church, How Church Growth Became a Science, Then an Obsession, and What's Next. And as you can tell from the title, it's got some overlap with your book, A Church Called Tov, Forming a Goodness Culture, which I have tagged like crazy since I read it a little over a year ago. I'm going to begin with a question that has probably been your first question on maybe every interview about this book, which is, so what is Tov?
Tov is a Hebrew word for good or goodness. It's, for instance, in Genesis chapter 1, everything that God does was Tov, and then it was Tov Ma'od, very good at the end. So it's used throughout the Bible for moral goodness. Jesus was Tov. The gospel is the Tov news. It's in Greek, but it's a translation of a Hebrew word. So Tov is a big idea. My daughter and I, we call it a master theological or moral category in the Bible. What God wants out of his people is Tovness, because God himself is Tov.
Did co-write this book with, I believe you said your daughter, right? Laura Barringer.
Yes. Yeah.
And in fact, the follow-up book, Pivot, that has come out just the last few months, you co-wrote with her as well.
That's correct. That's right.
Yeah, great to be able to work with family like that.
Yeah, she's got the writing bug.
Once it bites, I don't know if she'll be grateful to you or not for that, because as all of us writers know, having written is great, but doing the writing, well, musicians like to play, painters like to paint. Most writers do not like to write. We like having the writing done. You write that this book is about wounded healers and wounded resistors. And in fact, you introduced the book with some of the woundedness that you went through and some experiences around you. I don't need you to get into the details or the names on that or whatever you feel comfortable with. But how did a going through some wounded seasons bring about this book and the subject matter of it?
Okay, Karl, are you talking about Tov or Pivot?
I haven't read Pivot, so I took the quote, this book is about wounded healers and wounded resistors from Tov. Yeah,
we talk about transformed wounded resistors in the second book. My experience was with Willow Creek, and so was my daughter's, and that's what generated this book. I started getting questions constantly, both digitally and personally, when I was teaching about Willow Creek and Bill Hybels and what they can do so it doesn't happen to them, etc. So it was the questions that we were being asked, I was being asked, that led to some blog posts that generated a publisher to contact me and ask me to write that book. a book about Willow Creek. I said, no, they're not going to give me records, access to all the records in the church. And I said, I'm a New Testament professor. I'm not a church historian. I can't do this thing. But then we found an angle that was much more of a New Testament approach for me. And that was, I found something that really put together a section of the book called False Narratives. I told my daughter, I said, we have an idea if we can reframe this in a redemptive way. And the word Tov allowed us to reframe it. And our editor at Tyndale was very good at helping us kind of move the book from, let's say, the nasty stories, the toxicities in the church, to something redemptive. And that's sort of the origin of the book. But really odd for me, Karl, was I was reading, I'm fascinated by World War II German pastors like Bonhoeffer. I was reading a book about how the German pastors responded to the Holocaust and to World War II. And I was stunned by the inability of these pastors to admit complicity in the system. It was like, that was all Hitler, and he made us do this stuff. And I'm simplifying. So a man by the name of Matthew Hakanas, and he's a specialist on World War II stuff like this. And what stunned me, Karl, was the parallels between the German pastors and Roman Catholic priests and Southern Baptist pastors and the stories that were coming out of Chicagoland in connection with Willow Creek. In other words, here are pastors who preach God's grace and forgiveness for confession of our sinfulness, who seem to be unable to admit their complicity in some systemic sins or in some less than systemic personal sins. It just made me wonder, is this characteristic of humans trapped in a sinful human nature, or is this something we need to call attention to and to create churches that confess their sins and allow pastors to admit fault? So that's sort of where it began. For me, that was a stunning realization. And you've studied a lot of pastors over your life. I mean,
Yeah.
This is not that difficult to perceive unless it's you as the individual person.
Knowing that origin story makes the book even richer in my heart and mind now too, because while you do talk about coming out of those kinds of difficult seasons, your book does have that redemptive approach. There's no bomb throwing. There's none of that there. It's really, what are the solutions here? And it's what I'm hoping to do in all of my writing, and especially in this book, Desizing the Church, is the same thing. I want to take a look at some of how we got where we got, why this is a problem, and then what are some ways forward. Similar to the way you did World War II research, I do 3 chapters in my book about where the church growth movement came from. And it turns out that we actually had 2 church growth movements. We had the one that was begun by Donald McGavran in the mid 20th century. And he gave a lot of the terminology and a lot of the way of thinking about church growth that we currently use today. But it became superimposed upon what was already in the water through American history, this entrepreneurial, meritocratic, one of those tough words to pronounce, approach. That, hey, if it works, if they're getting enough people in the building, then there must be something good going on. And so I asked, where did this come from, and how did those two blend together in kind of a toxic stew where a lot of great things came out of the church growth movement? I think we've had enough now that I think we can look at it with some objectivity, hopefully, and see some of the unintended consequences. And I do believe they are unintended consequences, but all good things have unintended consequences. Let me go through some of the quotes that some of the times I quote you in my book, because this was one of the reasons I wanted to have you on, is I used your stuff. So maybe even some of this will be, did I use it accurately? Let's hope so, because the book is ready to print.
I'm really fascinated by what you're talking about with the church growth movement. Because I think the gospel that emerged from that was a slick, come forward and now everything's taken care of, a lack of discipleship, which I experienced in college when I first read Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So I'm going to be really interested in what you had to say. So let's hear what you quote.
Appreciate it. Yeah, in that chapter, I call it pre-made in America, because The church growth movement kind of was already in the water before McGavran came along and gave it some names. And actually, McGavran wanted to send it in a completely different direction, which is another conversation for another time, but is in the book. The first place where I quote you and Laura is in that chapter where you say something radical has seeped into the church in the last 50 years. The American meritocracy has reshaped pastors and churches, and a new culture has taken root based on achievement and accomplishment rather than holiness and Christ likeness. Later on, you also say, in such a climate, the role of the pastor has become completely redefined in many quarters, based far more on the business and meritocracy model than on scripture.
Oh, well.
There are good things about meritocracy. If you're going to promote someone because of their merit, because of what they did, rather than because of who their parent is, merit is good. But the church is not supposed to be based on meritocracy, on what we've done well. It's supposed to be based on grace and what Christ did and our complete lack of goodness in face of his overwhelming mercy. Let's talk about some of that. Where did this American meritocracy come from, and how do we even begin to overcome it when it's the water so many of us are just swimming in?
Well, Karl, this is a mouthful, and this is a huge issue. I'm not a specialist you know more about this development of the church growth movement, but let's just say that one of the fundamental aspects of American culture is pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, work hard, you get what you deserve. Americans are against high taxes and against, let's say, democratic socialism, however you want to call it, that is so characteristic of Europe, Australia, and New Zealand. And I have friends who can't understand the American system. And I tell them, America has this mentality, this worldview, that it's all up to you. You make your own living. What you earn is yours. I think that is one context for this. The other side of this is success in the United States breeds glory. And I suppose that's true everywhere, but everything like that gets bigger in the United States because it's so big, and we have the capacity to export everything that works. And the next thing you know, you have Willow Creek type models of church in South Africa where we were. And I thought, this is Willow Creek here. This is the same thing. It's been exported. And it's not the same, but it's pretty close to the same. But I think the key thing here is that there is an automatic ability, an automatic calculation by Americans that if something is big and growing, it's successful. And if it's big and growing and successful, someone's doing something right. I've spoken in some pretty big churches over the years, and I'm not bragging about that. I'm just saying I've been to these places, and they are very, very impressive. And I've been, churches that are 1,500 people, that there is such an impressiveness about it that you get this sense that they're really doing things well. Well, they are. There is a level of competence, a level of efficiency, a level of professionalization that is very impressive, that makes the system work and makes the system grow, and it attracts people to that system. All right, now, I don't want to deny that that's the case, but that doesn't make for a successful church in the sense of what Jesus wanted of his followers, or what the Apostle Peter, when he writes First Peter, or which is all about holiness, or at least that's his image of a Christian, and Paul's churches, they weren't ever obsessed with size, efficiency, and professionalization. They were measuring something else, far more difficult to measure, but because their world measured such things, they had skills to measure virtue. They had the skills to measure holiness. They had the skills to measure love. I was just looking at 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 8 through 12. Is at the end of a section that Peter's talking to these stations. He starts with the powers, and then the slaves, then the wives, and then the husbands, and then all of you. And the virtues that he wants for them are basically skills in relational ability to love one another, to show sympathy, to show compassion, to be brotherly in their love, and the ability to respond to the public, to the world when they suffer in ways that reflect this grace that they've experienced in Christ, this salvation, which is the topic of chapter 1. Those are the things that Peter cared about. And I've been in a lot of these big churches, and while they will talk that, the system does not favor discipleship or pastoral care of individual people. And something got off base. I don't know when it was. I know there were some big churches, like, say, First Baptist Church in Dallas, Texas, was a big church before, I guess, there were mega churches, before the church growth movement even.
Yeah.
So I know there were places that attracted lots of people, but something happened, something got in the water, and everything got professionalized and segmentized and turned into a routine and to an ability to take what worked in one church to another place and make it happen there. And all of a sudden we're reduplicating something, and it's working, and it seems to be the good thing. And I know there are good things that happen, but I also know that the emphasis on discipleship and spiritual development and maturity and formation were not there. And this is why, I know I'm talking at length here, this is why Dallas Willard and Richard Foster's development in the 80s was so attractive to people. There was something going on there that the people in these other churches knew was missing. So I know you know a lot more about this than I do, and you probably are saying, yeah, I talked about that as well. So.
Oh, no. Just a quick way of answering some of the questions you're asking, like the where did it come from? Some of where it come from, and in the book I go through a lot more than this, but some of where it came from was as an unintended consequence of some very good things from the church growth movement. One of the things I have always appreciated about big churches is when they discover something new, they are very quick to share it with everybody. They are very generous in doing this. Now, 50 years ago, when you and I were a lot younger, 50 years younger than this, there were only about a dozen churches in the country that were considered mega churches. The term hadn't even been invented yet. You could go to a very large, well-churched American city and not find a church of over 1,000 because there were very few of them. Now, as they got bigger, they needed to do things in new ways. And as they discovered new processes and methods in order to be able to have that many people in the room, they shared it with everybody. And then these systems, which worked across the board for mega size, started being practiced in churches of 50 and 100 and 500. And they worked in some churches of 500, but they didn't work in any churches of 100 or 50. And so the churches of 100 or the churches of 50 started feeling, well, either they're wrong or I'm stupid because this isn't working here. And it turns out they're not wrong. It works in their context. You're not stupid. It isn't designed for your context. And so we have this disconnect and this confusion about what's going on. And then we start assigning success markers only to the big ones who can use those ideas. So this generosity of spirit and of sharing new methods that are required for big churches had this unintended consequence. It's one of several things that we can get into, but I do want to get to these other quotes from you. So
I want to say, I like your idea. I think it's very kind to say it's generosity. I also think it's competition and glory.
And I mentioned that too, but I'd like to start out with the generous part. I'm not doing the compliment sandwich. I actually do see a great spirit of generosity coming from a lot of different places. I think ego cannot be separated from that, which, by the way, let's do that. And now a short break to talk about something else. If you like the content you're hearing, here are two things you can do for us. First, forward this podcast to a friend. Second, consider becoming a financial supporter through Patreon, Venmo, or PayPal. Just go to karlvaters.com/support. For as little as $3 a month, you can help us put these resources into the hands of the ministries that need them the most. Our support link is in the show notes. Chapter 7 of my book is entitled, are you ready for this? Inevitable, Why the Christian Celebrity Culture Guarantees Moral Failure. And I quote you and Laura in this. So let me tell you where I quote you, and you can tell me whether or not I misrepresented you. I don't believe that I did. Power has a way of ruining people, you wrote. Success has a way of turning ministers into celebrities. Therefore, pastors must resist the pull towards celebrity. That is, in fact, the closing sentence of that chapter about why Christian celebrity culture guarantees moral failure. That's from you and from Laura. Power has a way of ruining people. And what is wrong with a Christian becoming a celebrity? Where are the dangers in that?
Yeah. Well, power, we have a section on this. I studied some of this and I found that power has a way of affecting the brain and it becomes a narcissist. And the next thing you know, they can't relate to other people well. But celebrity, well, Caitlin Beatty wrote such a wonderful book on this because she developed it all. But celebrity is inspired by, let's say, competition that centers a person's gifts and charisma and preaching skills and platform in such a way that increasingly people see the person in terms of a hero and an all-star. And the next thing they're treated, they have all kinds of special treatment. They don't have to follow the rules. They don't even have to meet with people. They're not really pastors of anybody in the church. And I know at one time we were attending a mega church, and I remember having some symptoms. I've always had a little paranoia. And I wondered if I died, who in the world would do the funeral? Because I felt like I didn't have a pastor. I mean, I could name the man who was the pastor of the megachurch, but he didn't know me from anybody. I mean, if he did, he never let me know that. But there's something that happens with celebrities as cultivating, curating, and maintaining and sustaining and protecting an image that is put on the platform and that yields people who perform on that platform in order to bring people to that church the next week and on. A roller coaster it goes. And this was the development of Mike Lucan and Kent Carlson's book, Renovation of the Church, when they moved in the direction of a Dallas Willard spiritual formation church. They lost about half their congregation because they did not want to. They were very successful at bringing people to church, but they thought it was detrimental to personal spiritual formation and transformation in Christ.
Yeah, once those systems are set up, they take an enormous amount of time and energy just to maintain. And then it becomes almost like the drug addict chasing the bigger high, where if you're not getting the bigger number next year again and again and again, over and over and over again, then it starts being problematic. I'm going to quote you again. This is not one that I put in the book, but is from your book, A Church Called Dove. Not all big church or mega church pastors are celebrities, and some small and rural churches have pastors who think they are celebrities. What matters is not the size of the church, it's the size of the pastor's ego. So this isn't necessarily a size thing, but what I point out in my book is not that size is the problem, but that chasing bigness is the problem. This is a mindset. Size is just numbers, but bigness is a mindset that anybody can have at any size of a church or in any situation where I won't quote myself even accurately here, but at one point, I believe the quote is something like this: can you get the numbers up needs to disappear as one of the questions we ask prospective pastors.
That's really good. I think the job descriptions, I spent way too much time reading job descriptions of churches, and I was focused on larger churches. And it stunned me how little it had to do with preaching faithfully, studying the Bible regularly, going through the Bible. It was all, I remember having a conversation with someone from a megachurch who was like an assistant. And he was a great guy. He almost ran errands for people. And he was much loved in the church. And he said, my job is to create 3 buzz events a year. I have to find someone who can bring a huge audience. And these buzz events are measured over against each other. So it's like competition between the time it brought in, let's say, 15,000. And next time we want to get 16,500. And then the next year we want to get 18,000. They will create buzz events, and that is bring in some celebrity who will bring people to the church. But his job was to figure out what person could be the next buzz event. And they couldn't be the same. I mean, if you got, let's say, if you got, I guess Taylor Swift is big. If you got Taylor Swift, you're not going to get any bigger buzz event than that. But if you get Amy Grant or if you get Chris Tomlin, you're not going to get much bigger. But that's not what they were measuring it against. It was people that no one knew and that didn't know they were Christians. So some professional football player or basketball player or baseball player who was a new star, they could bring people in. Then the next year you get some business person who has told their story on CNN and now everybody knows they're a Christian. We'll bring them in. And then it's someone connected to a president. Buzz events, those are all designed to create bigness, is what you're saying. I totally agree with you. I think bigness is connected to glory, to competition, ambition, pride, ego. I think all those things are involved in that because who's got the biggest is one of the questions that I hear among pastors at times. Who's got the biggest choir? Who's got the biggest number of books sold? Who's got the biggest audience? Who's got the biggest platform? Who's got the biggest baptismal? I mean, these kinds of questions are actually discussed by pastors at times.
Cases, it actually acts as a protective layer against any criticism. Well, you can't criticize them. Look at the numbers. They must be doing something right.
I know.
And I'm not going around trying to criticize people, but nobody should be above proper biblical criticism. It doesn't matter what your numbers are. And yet that's often what happens. You're describing a staff member whose job description is dependent on competing with his own successes numerically. He's in competition with his own, with himself. I mean, wow.
Yeah. And measured, Karl, this is what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Measured by numbers.
Yep.
Or income, let's say a big offering, or the number of people who come forward. Not measured by whether everybody in the church is growing spiritually, but measured by quantitative numbers. Big issue right there.
Fascinating, because when I bring up this is a challenge to some pastors, occasionally I'll get, well, then they don't shift away from, okay, let's not use numbers, but use something else. They shift away from, okay, if not attendance, then what numbers should be measured? So, but it's always numbers based. There's never this idea that, wait a minute, some things aren't numerically verifiable. Some things are bigger than that. They're more important than that, which leads us to my last place that I quote you in the book. In my final chapter, which is entitled Desizing Evangelicalism. Yes, I actually dare to go there in my last chapter.
Courageous.
Here's how it goes. One type of disqualification is the narcissistic leader, I write. According to Scot McKnight and Laura Barringer in a church called Tove, here's your quote. It is common for a narcissist to want his church to be seen as the best, the biggest, and the most influential because he believes the glory belongs to the leader. There's no evidence to suggest that big churches are more likely to be led by narcissistic pastors than small ones, but all narcissists want the stage no matter how big or small it is. That last piece is my tag on to your quote. But let's talk about narcissism. I quote you and Chuck DeGroat particularly in this chapter about narcissism, just as I quote Caitlin Beatty in the celebrity chapter quite a bit. But why does it seem that we do seem to be attracted in the church recently, especially to narcissistic leaders? How is it that we're developing so many of them and attracted to them so much?
Okay, I would like to have had psychological studies of every pastor throughout the history of the church, so we would know how many of them. But here's the way I would look at it. Chuck DeGroat taught me that everybody who gets up on a platform, and then he said, Scott, you and I are professors. We're on a platform, and he said we're both on a platform on podcasts right now, or something like that, and we're both authors of books, and that's platform. He said, everybody on such a platform is on the spectrum of narcissism. And I thought, okay, I think you're probably right. Chuck, you know more about this than I do. And I think people who are aware of this are much healthier than people who aren't aware of this. But what we have to realize is that the platform attracts people who like to be platformed. So let's just say the pulpit attracts people who like to be behind a pulpit. People who are on TV like to be in a position where they can be seen and known. So let's just admit that this is a part of what we do. But there is a we want our message. For instance, I want my books to be read by people, and my publisher wants my books to sell. All right. So, okay, we're a good team right now. But when I measure my success by how many books sold rather than the impact that the book is making or how much money I make from it, I have ruined the gift that God has given me to write. The same happens with pastors. But what we do attracts people to do what we're doing. We have to admit this. We have to recognize this and realize that that's part of what is happening. And no one is going to be completely purged of that desire. Although I've met lots of pastors in my life, and I've met so many of them who are humble people and very successful. I've had professors who are really well known, who are very humble people. And I know some pastors of big churches who are really well known and they're very humble people. And I've known some pastors of little churches who are just arrogant. I could use Lutheran words that wouldn't be very edifying. I think we need to recognize this, that this pastoral position, this pulpit, this platform is going to be attractive to only certain kinds of personalities. Introverts don't want to be up there. Genuine introverts, genuine people who are avoidant don't want to be up there. We need to recognize that right now there's only a certain percentage of people who even want those platforms. And in that circle are people whose motives are so contaminated that they have the capacity to ruin it, to glorify themselves and to see themselves as stars and heroes, and then to abuse anybody who doesn't want to support that vision that they have for themselves. And we all know some stories of people like this. I think we have to recognize this, and I talk about this in my classes. If you start to recognize patterns of narcissism, that you want to be congratulated for your sermon, that you feel bad when people aren't praising you, then you need to start talking to a therapist and to a spiritual counselor or to a whatever spiritual formation person and start working on this early in your ministry so that it doesn't become toxic into your personality and ruin the church itself, because it can. It inevitably probably will. But the other side of this, Karl, you know that the people who are really good at what they do and who are narcissists can mask the narcissism and succeed on the platform, and they can preach amazing sermons and tell incredible sermons, and they can move people's hearts, and they can change people's personalities, and people can be transformed. So they're really good at what they do. And they're the only ones who get to the biggest platforms usually. So they're good at it. And it's pretty hard to be critical of seeing lots of people come to Christ. But that's something that has to be perceived and discerned by the spiritually discerning.
Appreciate that very much. That's why I've written this book. We've got to understand the danger of this desire to pursue bigness at virtually any cost. We have to reconfigure our value system to a more Christ-like value system rather than the value system of the culture around us. But it takes work because the culture around us does seep into us in ways that are virtually invisible. And we have to make a real conscious effort with the help of the Holy Spirit himself within us to be able to even recognize these dangers, let alone to counteract them in healthful ways. So thank you so much for that wisdom. This is from a church called Tove, which I quoted in my book, Desizing the Church. But you also have since then written Pivot, which is a follow-up to a church called Tove. So in the last minute or two that we have available before letting you go, give us an idea of what Pivot covers as a continuation of a church called Tove.
The most common question my daughter and I were asked after we wrote Tove, and I've done over 225 podcasts about these two books combined. So a lot of people are interested in this. The most common question is, what can we do in our church to either eliminate the toxicity and build Tove culture, or to form a church that is based on a Tove culture? So We studied organizational transformation. I had one of my DMin students actually provide for me the things I needed to read and study. And I came into contact with some very good literature that helped me understand the dynamic of transforming an institution. And then I theologized it by letting Paul's words, Jesus's words, the Bible's words become the categories that we were using. And so I had to correct some of the things from the business world, and I had to eliminate some things and added things. So we have built the priorities and practices and the powers that are at work in churches that are being transformed to become a Tov culture. We also provide what we call the Tov tool, which gives churches a set of questions that will provide an opportunity for people in the church who are vested in that church to discuss things that will, we believe, if done in a safe environment, reveal areas that need to be worked on in that church. So we want churches to analyze themselves and to begin working on church culture rather than numbers. And I think, Karl, when we shift from numbers to culture, we are moving in the right direction of spiritual formation, the kinds of things we see in Peter and Paul and Jesus, than the things that have happened. And you know this in the church growth movement, where everything seems to get measured by numbers. So that's Pivot.
I'm looking forward to that. I encourage our listeners, check out A Church Called Tov if you haven't read that yet, and then pick up Pivot. The subtitle to Pivot is a long one: The Priorities, Practices, and Powers That Can Transform Your Church into a Tov Culture. Scot, I deeply appreciate your time with us today. We had a couple interesting things just trying to get this thing together, but I'm glad we did. I appreciate your unknowing contributions to my book as well and this conversation today. Thanks so much.
Thank you, and I look forward to seeing your book, Karl. Bless you.
As I was writing Desizing the Church, and now as I've been going through these interviews that have reminded me and expanded on some of the content that was in them, one of the things that it really is bringing to mind is the importance of just simple, straightforward ministry. That if we're seeking a platform, if we're seeking fame, if we're seeking celebrity, we are actually seeking the wrong things. And Scot McKnight, especially in his book, A Church Called Tov, with Laura Barringer, really emphasizes this simplicity and this idea that we want a church that is promoting the goodness of God into a community that really needs to hear that. So I guess I want to close by speaking to my fellow small church pastors who often maybe feel discouraged because other people have more people in their church. Others are invited to speak at conferences or write books or be on podcasts. And all I can say is the pastors that are doing the work the best are the ones who are really spending their time in the local congregation, getting to know the people. Yes, there are pastors in big churches with big platforms who are also doing great work, but that's not the bulk of where God has called us to. So if the Lord has called you to a simple church and a simple ministry in a simple place, embrace it and celebrate it, because there's so much to gain there. I really encourage you to do that and not to seek something else. Next week, I'll be interviewing Dave Gibbons. He's the founding pastor of New Song Church. We'll have an enlightening conversation about the long, painful, but ultimately rewarding process that the Lord brought him and his church through to become what they now call the home of the misfits and the marginalized. Remember, my new book, Desizing the Church, How Church Growth Became a Science, Then an Obsession, and What's Next, is now available wherever you buy books, either electronically or in print. And if you'd like me to come and speak to your group about the issues that I raise in it, to a pastoral group, or even if you're interested in getting a book club going, reach out to me at karlvaters.com/contact me. This episode was produced by Veronica Beaver. It was edited by Phil Vaters. Original theme music was written and performed by Jack Wilkins of jackwilkinsmusic.com. The graphic design is by Solomon Joy. And me, I'm Karl Vaters, and I hope to talk with you again in the church lobby.